I'm Lisa Lupo, the Director of Communications for the Acheson Group, TAG, and I'm here with David Acheson, the founder and CEO of the company. Today, we'd like to talk a little bit about supply chain risk. So, David, it has been said that supply chain risk is the fastest growing threat for many food companies. Why would that be?
Lisa, that's a great question. And I think one looks at history on supply chain. And supply chain risk has been there for as long as we've been sourcing food from foreign manufacturers and growers or domestic companies. So every food company is reliant on getting something from somebody for the most part and doing something with it and to add value to it. When I was a regulator years ago at FDA, I think one of the things we realized there at the agency was food companies are really pretty good at controlling the risks in their own four walls, but heavily rely on suppliers to control the food safety risks in what they are receiving from suppliers. And the relationship with suppliers was more financial or quality related than it was food safety. That was resulting in significant recalls and problems, which I think everybody in the food industry would recognize. Yeah, we've had problems with our suppliers. Because of that, that drove a specific part of the Food Safety Modernization Act statute, so the laws that provide the framework for the regulation, to say manufacturers, processors, packers, and holders need to understand the risks in their supply chain, number one, and number two, control them. So fundamentally, what are the risks, and put in a program to control those risks. And that was the fundamental in the statute that led to that part of the regulatory requirements in the preventive controls for human foods and animal foods. The daunting side to that is it doesn't matter whether you are a $2 million company or a $50 billion company. Likely you've got multiple suppliers. The bigger you are, probably the more you have. And just simply managing that becomes a challenge in terms of the risk. And it very quickly becomes evident I think every food safety professional would resonate with this concept that, well, not all suppliers are equally risky. There's ingredients that we receive that we're not worried about. We've never had a problem with them. They have a history of being completely safe. And besides, the biggest potential risk is a microbiological one. And we're going to take this ingredient, and we're going to mix it with a bunch of others, and we're going to cook the heck out of it for 3 hours. So if there is a risk there, we're going to control it. And so that's in that scenario, that's a low risk ingredient from a microbiological risk perspective. Now, you sort of take that and say, well, here's an ingredient that I'm using where I'm not going to control the risk. And a common example that I've spoken about in the past, but I think it's a really good one, is spices. Okay. So let's take the example of one of my favorites, which is black pepper, which has a history of causing problems. Yeah. Spices, they're renowned to have salmonella in them. You start to look, and there's contamination. It's just there because of the upstream supply chain challenges. So if I'm taking black pepper as an ingredient, and I'm to my earlier scenario, I'm mixing it with a bunch of other things, I'm putting it in a soup kettle and I'm cooking it for 3 hours. If the salmonella are in there, it's dead salmonella by the time I'm done. So I've controlled the risk internally. Okay. I'm doing that in facility A in my plant. Over there in facility B across the street, I make potato chips. And I take ground black pepper and I sprinkle it on those potato chips after they've been cooked, just before they go in the bag, to add a little last minute flavor. Same supplier, same ingredient, same risks in terms of upstream. Very different scenarios in terms of how I'm controlling the risk. So in my potato chip side, I'm relying on the supplier 100% to control that risk. On my soup line, I'm controlling the risk, same supplier, same ingredient. So my message there is look at the inherent risks in your ingredients, the supply behaviors to control those risks, and what you're doing with it. And when you put that together, that will allow you then to look at whether you've got 50 suppliers or 1,000 to rank them. And only, I believe, only by ranking supply and supply chain risk can you really effectively manage it. The concept of one size fits all supply chain risk control might make you feel good, but it doesn't really effectively manage the risk. So fundamentally, risk ranking. And that's really where FDA is pushing us. That's what the requirement is about. Assess the risks in your suppliers. Who's controlling that risk? Is it me? Is it the supplier? If it's the supplier, essentially verify that they are controlling that risk. And certainly look at the risk, whether it's a potential class 1 risk or a class 2 or a class 3, and manage it accordingly. So it's a very complex space. There's limited resources to be able to do it, to manage supply chain risk, but there is a way to do it effectively, but it does involve spending some time looking at those different risk ranking profiles and managing accordingly.
One thing you did mention though is, you've got a ingredient that's never had a problem before.
Right.
Today we're finding there are ingredients that suddenly are having problems, which adds to the complexity. How do we manage that?
That is a really excellent point, that the list of foods that have been associated with illness only ever gets longer. It never gets shorter. And clearly there's plenty of historical examples of how that list continues to grow. What that speaks to is trying to take a scientific approach to the way either an ingredient, whether it's an raw agricultural ingredient or a manufactured ingredient, look at the inherent risks around what it is and where it's grown and how it's processed and how it's handled. And absolutely don't make the assumption that just because we've never seen a problem that we never will. I think that is a lesson that we have learned. And yet, if you take something within that, Lisa, and you say, well, I'm sourcing citrus fruit and I'm sourcing leafy greens. Now, theoretically, we could get pathogens on citrus. We could have pesticide residues on citrus. Leafy greens, we could have pathogens and we could have pesticide residues.
Right.
I've got so many dollars in my supply chain budget. Am I going to split them equally between the two? No, I'm not. I'm going to focus on my leafy green supplier more than I am on my citrus supplier. So history plays a part.
Okay.
But am I just going to sort of look at my citrus supplier and say, oh, I'm just not going to bother about you. I'm not worried about you at all. No, that's the wrong approach. We need to look at, well, what could happen? And you sort of do your assessment and say, well, I could probably worried about pesticide residues, for example. I want to make sure that program is robust. But we should never discount something as zero risk, because that's got us in trouble.
Yes.
And again, it sort of speaks to shifting that risk ranking based on what we know. We can only do it based on the science that we have and the intel we have about risks. And when that changes, which it does, we need to update our risk rankings. We need to update our assessments and learn from what is happening in others. And I think the food industry is much better at that today than they used to be. It's like, well, that happened to George down the street, but it'll never happen to me, even though we're doing the same thing. I think that mentality, thankfully, is sort of going into the rearview mirror. But that's definitely something we have to learn constantly and update.
Okay. Any other recommendations for the industry on supply chain risk and reducing it?
Well, fundamentally, it is a challenge, and I think one has to look at supply chain risk through truly creating a program in your own company that's got all the right players. Supply chain risk isn't controlled only by food safety and quality assurance team. You need food safety, quality assurance, you need procurement, you need operations, you might even need marketing, you need product development. So to control supply chain risk appropriately, you've got to have those who are conceptualizing a new food, seeking out new suppliers, looking at those complexities. And if QA come in at the last minute and say, no, guys, you just spent $5 million developing this product, but we're not going to let you source from that supplier, you find you end up in a business pickle.
Right. And
so I think that's important to recognize that supply chain risk control isn't pure food safety. It has to be a team effort, because at the end of the day, we have to make food. We have to make it economically, realistically, with a margin on it to be able to sell it and balance all of those risks. And that's not something that is just done by the food safety experts. It has to be more a broader team.
Okay. And David, how can TAG help in this area?
We have a lot of experience at TAG around helping companies just navigate that risk ranking strategy. Many companies come to us with complex supply chain risk control programs, but it's often a one-size-fits-all. Well, everybody has a certificate of analysis, everybody has a third-party audit. And then you get data overload, and it's like, I don't have time to look at all of this stuff, and I'm looking for the red flags, and every now and again I miss stuff. So I think our fundamental approach is built on, number one, is your thinking about supply chain risk control aligned with best-in-class strategy, which essentially is looking at that risk ranking profile. Where are my risks with the ingredients, with this, what supply is doing with it, and what I'm doing with it? So that's step number one. Number two is looking at, am I conveying the right message to my suppliers in terms of supplier expectations? Some companies have complex expectation manuals. TAG can help you build those, review those, get them to be industry best in class, if that's the route you want to go. You may have a requirement around certificates of analysis. We do a lot of work at looking at the way those are constructed so that they're meaningful. We do a lot of work too on helping companies establish programs for not just risk ranking up front, but trending supplier behaviors going forward, because you may have onboarded a supplier because they met all your criteria, and then they slip, something happens. How do you track that? How do you trend that? So that you've got those yellow flags popping up before they turn into red flags on supplier. So many of the food safety professionals at TAG have managed supply chain risk control in large companies, or from a regulatory perspective. And essentially what we are able to do is to bring that collective wisdom to help you manage your supply chain risk control through both the lens of economic consequence, appropriate investment, and truly managing food safety risks as well as regulatory requirements.
Okay. Well, thank you, David. And I hope that the industry has learned a bit from your expertise.
Thank you, Lisa. It's a pleasure.
Well, thank you, David. I think we've kind of discussed the key issues of COVID-19 and what's happening today. And we will be back to discuss further topics on another video. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you.